Hi, welcome to the Faster blog or podcast, depending how you're getting to it. I wanted to do something a bit more voiceover-y and a bit less writing-y, because as you probably tell from the start of this, grammar's not my strong point. But I am a trainer, so that's my excuse. Here we go. So I've been building a course called Obsessed About Energy Systems. I've been doing this to put together the components of training that are required to get your client a result. And so the way we sort of see it at Faster is your client wants a result, and the result they want is either going to be a skill or it's going to be a physical change. And by that I mean an actual change in body shape, or it's going to be an ability change. And by that I really mean something that's more sort of dominated by stronger, run further. So these aren't necessarily sat out on their own. So if you change someone's ability, strength or endurance or similar, then obviously their physical appearance will change. If you change someone's physical appearance, then their ability will change. Sometimes the change, or always the change in ability, will affect their ability to perform a skill, and their skill will affect their ability, and performing the skill regularly will change their physical shape, and changing their physical shape might also change how they perform their skill. So it all interlinks. However, to get one to become the most important component of what you do may also be detrimental to another. And this is the problem we have at the moment in the industry, where when I started on the lecturing circuit, I was heavily influenced by a guru, and so I was pushing out 3D functional training. Like, that's the way, the only way. That's how we train. Everything in 3D. Let's go forward and back, left and right, round the corner right, round the corner left. Let's hit it hard. And then it was quite shortly after, so just prior to 2007, that we kind of said, well, actually sequencing of bones, joints and muscles could be as important as working with just putting 3D to everything. So the evolution of training had gone machine, and then from machine it had gone to free weights, and from free weights it had gone to free weights in 3D. And then I was thinking, well, going back to my roots as a coach, really the outcome, the performance of the client should dominate the training behind that. And that's kind of where we got to now. So currently I'm writing a course on energy systems and how that links to what we do and how we train and how we perform. Something that I think the strength conditioning world does a really good job on, and they spend a lot of time in there. The bodybuilding world spend a lot of time in energy systems, and certainly in the nutrition mind powering energy systems, but the functional training world less so. It's a less focused approach, often more holistic, so but not always that focused on getting the result. And so what I wanted to do today is just kind of share with you how far I've got along with their energy systems, but also the thought process that's underpinning and that's coming out from all the research to reinforce some of my pre-course writing bias that I'm trying to get rid of, and some things that are really showing that when people talk about 3D functional training, really what they're doing is they're setting you up for average, but maybe better body looking, but average performance potentially. And it'll explain why it's so important to understand things such as Faster's HMAC eyes. Okay, so a brief sort of review of how a muscle contracts concentrically. Well, it could actually be contracting in any way: concentrically, eccentrically, isometrically, and so well, what we're looking at is when you require force to be generated by the muscle that's not through the elastic properties of the tissue. And so what happens here is you have a nerve, and that nerve comes into muscle fibre, and then the nerve provides an electrical impulse that we call an action potential, that then makes its way across the muscle fibre, and it goes into these sort of long tubes called T tubules, and so inside there's a chemical reaction which releases calcium, and so the calcium that releases then goes into the contractile part of the muscle, which is the place where actin and myosin sit together, which is the cytoplasm. So this should be a review to you. If you're brand new to the industry, this is covered in depth in courses, and this will cover in more depth in our course. So actin and myosin, the way that works together is that you have them sat opposite each other. So in a sarcomere, like the contractile unit, then they sort of sit either side of each other, and there's what's called the sliding filament theory, which is more like a grab, pull, jump theory. So what happens is, in here you have actin filaments, which are the sort of these thin lines. So these is kind of your actin, and then you have myosin, which is sitting between the two, and they sort of have double-headed, almost like grippers at the end. And what happens is, on the actin, you have sites for these grippers. I'm trying to keep this as basic as possible because this is not really what the talk is about. And so what happens is, and forgive the diagram, but what happens is calcium sort of takes the cap off the receptor sites on the actin. These the myosin binds to the sort of the nearest site, and then there's an energy exchange, and the myosin does it again. So it's like grab, then grab the next one, then grab the next one, then grab the next one, until that muscle fibre is as short as possible. If there's enough either impulses or a strong enough impulse for that to happen, and then what happens is there's like a calcium pump, pulls out the calcium, covers up all these receptor sites, there's a relaxation, the muscle fibre gets longer again, and then the process starts again. And so the point of that is, it comes down to this. And so, and that's the electrical signal, which is the action potential, coming from the nerve cell, and that's really what causes this muscle to start to shorten. And so we need to know that this is all powered by ATP and ATP conversion to ADP, which I'll talk about next. But it's this nerve impulse that's really important to us, because obviously that's what caused the contraction to happen, and the nerve impulse is specific to that muscle fibre, or those that muscle, the connection of sort of motor, the whole motor unit, and it's that really is important when we start to talk about 3D functional training and how that could be ruining strength, but remember, could be making them look better. So I just wanted to recap sliding filament theory as quickly and simply as basically as I could, and avoid as much chemistry as possible, because you're trainers, and I want you to get to the bit that we can most influence. However, we do cover this more in the course if this is something that does interest you. So the key to getting this generation of force from the sort of sliding filaments in their muscle fiber is a muscle twitch. And so what happens is you get that stimulation. So if we did a graph, if a graph looked like this, and this was time, and this was muscle tension, then what happened is you have the sort of initially the muscles at rest, and then you have a stimulation about here. Then you have a latent period where nothing's really happening, and then all of a sudden you go up and you have a contraction phase, and then slowly that disperses, and that's the relaxation phase, and you're back. So you have this point up here. So this is the contraction phase, this is the latency period, and this is the time of stimulation. And so what happens is that's what we call a muscle twitch. So there's stimulation, then there's a time for the action potential to get across the muscle fiber. That's the latency period. Then there's a contraction phase where force is produced, so there's tension there, and then that tension either wins concentrically, draws isometric, or loses eccentric, change in tissue length. Then there's a relaxation phase. So the question really then becomes about the muscle twitch. To generate tension, the body has two systems. So these are both called summation. So you have multiple fiber summation, and that's where the body starts recruiting muscle fibers depending on the amount of power required, which affects the central nervous system signal to the motor nerves, and the smaller motor nerves are more excitable. They start contracting or causing contraction first, so that's kind of a lower tension generated. And then if more tension is required, the central nervous system sends stronger signals, and then that recruits their bigger motor units. And so it's that process that increases the tension. It's all or nothing. So you're either recruiting a motor unit or you're not. So you kind of go from small to large, and you just increase the amount of fibers being used to produce force. So that would be multiple fiber summation, but there's also frequency summation. So that's how often are the contractions happening. So if you had one action potential, then you get a contraction and a relaxation. But if you get two, the closer they are together, the sort of more force is generated initially at least. And so that is a frequency summation. So how quickly do you keep sending signals to the muscle fibers to keep increasing? So the more you send a signal to the muscle fiber, the more times it will contract. If you keep a gap in between, then the muscle will have time to relax fully and then contract again. And if you think back to how that happens, then that means as the cross bridging happens, then there'll be a cross bridge, then the calcium will be dragged back in, and then the cross bridge will unhook, and then the muscle will start to return to length. But if there's another stimulus straight away, the calcium won't have time to be removed completely, and so you'll keep contracting. So then there's something called tetanus, which is related to frequency summation, and tetanus is sort of like a sustained muscle contraction. So it means that the frequency of stimulus is so great that the muscle fibers can't relax prior to the next stimulus arriving. So the power output kind of hits a total level, or it doesn't. And so you can have a complete tetanus, which means you've hit maximum tension from the muscle and there's no relaxation, or you can have an incomplete or unfused tetanus where if it's a slower rate then there's a relaxation, but it's not complete, and then it starts again, so you never get that completely kind of fully fused tetanus thing happening. And then finally you can get sort of a different effect where you get kind of a stair step increase in the force of a contraction. So you don't get enough enough of the signals to cause like a complete tetanus, but what happens is that you still get a frequency that allows an increase in steps for the muscle power output. So if we graph how these look, then here we have that maximum tension, which is the tetanus, if it stays at that point, but it's the maximum amount of tension the muscle can give. So it's when that muscle fibre is sort of fully powered up, it's giving you what it has. So what happens is in sort of like a single twitch, you will get a twitch here, and then what you'd see from muscle tension is you'd see an increase and then a drop until the next twitch, and so that might be here. Now what happens if you start to get the step happen is that the frequency of the twitch is more regular. So what you get is you get a delay and then a lift and then a drop and then a lift and then a drop and then a lift, and so there's enough time for that to back off, but also there's not enough time for it to back off completely. And then finally you could get something there's such a big frequency or such a regular frequency of twitches coming through that you get that tetanus happen, so you get maximum tension happen, and the way that works is that you hit that top and then eventually you just stay there. Now this component here, this step, could go up and above and back down, so it could equally sort of hit that top level and stay there, which is kind of cool too. But that's how you get that maximum tension out of that muscle fiber that you're trying to produce force from. So how do these muscle fibers get that twitch? So muscle fibers are part of what's called a motor unit, and so a motor unit is interesting because a motor unit is a collection of muscle fibers that are all powered by a single neuron. Now in the smaller muscles, the smaller joints in the body where you need a more fine skill, then there's far less muscle fibers per motor unit, and that allows a really specific movement to happen. Whereas in the sort of larger, more powerful joints around the body, where you need less fine control and more power, for example, say quads, then what you'd have is you'd have more muscle fibers per motor unit. So a motor unit could be as few as say 3, or it could be as many as, I don't know, say 1,000. And so the motor unit will control these muscle fibers, and in some cases motor units will overlap with each other. What it means is you have this all or nothing thing going on, but it means that if you were looking at, say, transferable strength, for example, probably the less defined the movement is, then the more transferable most movements are to getting that strength up. So, if you get stronger quads across all angles, it's probably going to have a good carryover. However, if there's a very specific movement that you want to occur, you could get strength carryover in the quads, but you wouldn't necessarily get the accuracy you want down at the ankle. And so I'm kind of making a presumption there. I'm not telling you what I've read, but the important thing there is that if you were looking to make a muscle bigger, which is kind of what we're talking about, if you want to make a muscle bigger, then it would make a lot of sense to look at 3D functional training, because you can get at all the different motor units and get them performing at all different kind of levels. So that'd be a cool thing for aesthetics. But if you were trying to get a really precise motor skill down, especially one, say, like a golf swing or something really sort of specific and intricate, where the slightest movement off can have quite a profound effect on how you move, then maybe you don't want things that are generic, especially if your client's very good at what they do. And so then you maybe want specific, and actually going generic might be a downside. And one of the things that I want to talk about 3D functional training is it isn't actually the 3D or the functional component that might be the problem with ruining your client's strength. It might be that it's a mixture of the vagueness of the movement, which is not so much of a problem, but it also might be that the vagueness of the movements means you can't get the skill level together to get the strength component you want, and so you have to go down the weights, which means to hit fatigue you have to go up the reps, and going up the reps will give you growth but not necessarily the strength you need to perform the thing you do. And so that's when this all starts to come together, and when you marry that with everything we spoke about so far, it starts to make sense. But it means we really need to start to talk a little bit about muscle fibers. So you have 3 types of muscle fibers. So you actually have 2 types and 1 type split into 2 categories. And again, this is kind of a review. So you have the type 1, and the type 1 sort of, that's slow to contract. It's got a small motor neuron, so it's more excitable or easier to excite but slower to contract. So if you were doing something that required a low speed and a low strength, then that would be something that you might recruit rather than, say, a type 2A fiber, which has got a medium sized motor neuron, is moderately fast, and then you've got a type 2X, so you've got a type 2A which is moderate, and you've got a type 2X which is rapid. So if you're initiating a movement, it would make sense that you start at the type 2X, and then depending on the intensity and the duration and things, you work towards a type 1. But however, if you're already moving and got momentum and you're just kind of steering things, it might mean that really at low intensity you're mainly using type 1 muscle fiber types. Now, type 1 are mainly aerobic in nature, so that they get their ATP from the aerobic system, which means that there's a duration of use which is hours. Just to recap, the aerobic system is actually 3 systems, and it's getting its ATP by processing fat or carbohydrate or protein. It prefers carbohydrate. It can use fat quite easily. It doesn't really like to use protein. So the type 1 muscle fiber, it's got a low force production but can carry on for a long time. It has everything in place to be good aerobically, lots of mitochondria, lots of capillary sort of density, so lots of nutrients in there, lots of mitochondria to convert them. It lasts for hours, and so it's kind of cool. And what people don't realise is it has got quite a big potential to grow, or almost as much as the type 2 muscle fibers, which is something that people forget, and that's the moderate to high intensity that will get you the size that you want. It means it's quite strong too, and so potentially that's what you lean on when you're using 3D functional training and not respecting the sort of time and effort levels required to hit the type 2A and type 2X. So a type 2A fiber that's the lactate kind of muscle, and so it's got long-term anaerobic capabilities, which means it works really hard and can work really hard for about 30 minutes, and so it's the side effect to the way it gets its ATP is lactate, and lactate can then combined with other reasons can cause the muscle to be unable to contract anymore, and that's kind of its limit. Type 2A kicks in depending upon the level of the signal that it receives from the neuron. So initially, as you move, it's probably in within about sort of 10 to 30 seconds, depending on the intensity and how much it's in there. Remember, all energy systems are providing all the time. And then it kicks in as well when you require extra power as you're moving, because as you require that extra power, then the signal to the muscle will go up, and obviously that'll activate the motor units around the 2A, and that'll give you that contraction. So the type 2X fibers, they are fast twitch. They're out in a they can be out in a matter of sort of seconds. It's a mixture. Normally we talk about a mixture of energy systems. So there's some ATP present in the muscle, and then there's the creatine phosphate system, where creatine phosphate interacts with ADP, and that's how you get your ATP and you carry on. It's very short term, but it's very explosive, produces a lot of power, and so tends to be the type 2A muscles that grow most, tends to be the ones that people focus on. When you look at recovery across these muscle fiber types, then there's no real sort of immediate fatigue with the aerobic system. But when you're looking at the lactate, you're looking at sort of for a full recovery it would be 8 minutes, and when you're looking at the creatine phosphate system, for like a 90%, 92% recovery, it's about 3 minutes. So when you're building in your sets and reps, which now you might be questioning, actually what you're really thinking is, I'm working for about 10 seconds absolutely flat out here, and then if I want a full recovery, then I'm going 3 minutes, but maybe I don't want a full recovery because I know there's probably about 5 minutes worth of use in there in total if I keep going. So I probably have a lower recovery time if I really want to stress this system. It's unusual for that because normally when you're talking about stressing this system, you're not talking about getting a frequency summation to increase your power output. Instead, you're looking for a muscle fiber type summation. So you want to recruit more than your nervous system perhaps naturally wants to give you. So you're fighting that first stage of fatigue system, which is the anticipatory output that comes from the anticipation of how much work you have to do. A type 2, when you hit the lactate, then that's a slightly different proposition, You probably do want to keep the rest time lower than the full recovery time quite considerably as well. And then the idea there would be to keep challenging to the point of overload, and so you would train in that sort of 30 seconds to 3 minutes really high intensity level of training, with the idea being that you could probably do that for 30 minutes total. Longer maybe if you have the right recovery time, and that will really stress and push overload on the type 2A. That might be a mixture of what you want to do there is a mixture of more muscle fiber recruitment and sort of that summation force. And then for the aerobic, that's going to be long, but could be quite intense. So if you really sort of smash that system, so it gets to the point where it has to kick in lactate at some point, or it has to kick in the phosphate system, that could be a good way of getting to these muscle fibers. What the research has shown on hypertrophy is that a lot of the studies for hypertrophy have been biased towards the type 2 muscle fibers, but actually if you get sort of a higher intensity but not like full, so like an 80 to 90% rep max, and then you train with a higher rep range than say the 2s and 3s or the 1s to 4s that you're using at that type 2X. If you train around the sort of like, I suppose the traditional 10 to 12, but you can go up to 20. As long as you're hitting fatigue, you'll get muscle growth. However, if you want to be strong, then that's a different question. So the final component for this is, well, what the hell was I talking about at the start where I said 3D training might be ruining your client's strength? Well, what I mean here is when you train someone who has talent, so if they have talent and they're really good, so they're this end of the spectrum, compared to not very good, so new, I'm going to put, rather than rubbish, then that means the specificity of the recruitment of muscle fibers to perform the skill will be very precise here. But here will be generic. So I'm a terrible golfer. If I went out and did golf and you did shoulder press, then you'd see an improvement in my golf. However, if I train a top level golfer and I start to do shoulder press with them, I won't have a dramatic effect on their golf swing. Whereas if I manage to help them within their sequence of bones moving, joints feeling, muscles reacting, produce a resistance that is close to the golf but also at the same time provide some kind of overload, then I've got a good chance that I will improve what they do. Now, the important thing here is that strength isn't how much force you can produce, although it isn't. Strength when you're training a client should be, how does the strength relate to the role or the goal of the client? And so in some texts, and when I say text, I'm less talking journals now, I'm more talking some of the strength conditioning books. They try and define all the different strengths, but really, rather than say, oh well, you've got a relative strength which is body weight related, or you've got a real strength or an actual strength which is more related, absolute strength which is more related to what you can move actually. What you're really talking about when you talk about strength is your ability to produce power or produce force in a relevant movement. And so if you're producing power or force in a relevant movement, then that's something different, because that's not just about how much power output you can get from the muscle, whether that's from muscle fiber summation, whether that's from muscle fiber recruitment. That's more about can you get the sequencing of firing in the sequencing of the skill. And so that's skill development, and skill development builds around proprioception, but also you're built into fatigue management and anticipatory thoughts of your ability to control or not control motion, which so it starts to move away from what we've talked about there, and we start to go away from the muscle kind of and say, right, the muscle's not going to be our limiting factor. What's going to be our limiting factor is the central nervous system. And so that means we have to start looking at skill, fatigue, the whole psychology behind the movement. And then you might start to come back and say, right, well, 3D functional training will change body shape, so it will improve the client's perception of how well they move, which therefore will allow them to tap into more muscle fiber recruitment because they have more confidence. However, it could also be the fact that they're already very confident and so don't need any of that, and they can tap that anyway. And so really what you need to be doing is looking at fatigue patterns in game and then giving solutions to change their movement back to their best movement in the game itself. And so that means if someone says, what's the best exercise for this sport? The answer has to be, that's the bad question. The best question is, what's the best exercise environment for the psychology of my client to produce the best skill with most force? And in some sports, what's the best movements I can give the client to help remind them what their best movement is when they hit fatigue in the sport that they train. And it's nothing to do with the energy system other than when you then get to that point in the sport, you notice a change in the movement, and so you put it back. Then when you put it back but under fatigue, that's the point when you'll start to adapt positively, and that positive adaptation will be the thing that improves what people call strength. Now, just to throw it all around again, maybe in your sport strength looks like size, and so that's a massive component, and then we can go back to 3D functional training and everything else to try and get some size with you, with some generic skill rollover. Maybe the actual finite skill of what you do is not that big, so you're willing to lose a little bit of that in order to get some size. Maybe even strength is not as important as the weight you hold, and so you're willing to do some stuff that maybe not going to give you the best strength carryover, but will give you the best size carryover, and that's what you need to do. And so the answer is, the reason 3D functional training is ruining your client's strength is everything could be ruining your client's strength because it's so multidisciplined. And that would be the bottom line of it all. So that as we look at being a trainer again, you've got to go back to that initial component that we spoke about at the start, which is what's the result of the client and how do I integrate those three components to make it work.